Hi friends, my name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Riga. So you probably noticed the little cat in the background. She has a very bright collar on. It's a bird. An alert bird collar, because if the bright colors help alert birds. It's not some sort of weird decoration that we like to dress cats up in. So anyway, I don't know if you've noticed, if you've ever gone to, say, for example, the Joe Rogan channel. It's called the Joe Rogan Experience. And he often has he does some interesting interviews, and he does some interviews with left people like journalist Abby Martin and people like Jimmy Dore. And that's really great. And, you know, sometimes he has interesting guests. And the problem with having talk shows is that you tend to have to if you want to do it every day in particular, you end up sort of having guests who maybe may not be, they may not be on the same page as you, or some of their views are really out there. So that's the problem with having a talk show. You end up getting on people who maybe you would not normally get on with. And sometimes they can say some out there things. And for example, the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan, he tends to have guests that a sort of, I'll be really frank and say their attitudes towards women are not so great. It's sort of couched in this kind of, I was just looking at Alia in the background there, she loves rolling in the dirt. It's often couched in a kind of, this sort of sensitive, in a kind of trying to be politically correct, but it really, but then also disparaging it at the same time, political correctness. And I often find that many of his male guests on that show are actually, underneath it all, you can feel sort of this resentment towards women, that they are expected to be in some ways politically correct or sensitive to women or whatever. It's this, and even Joe Rogan himself, he sort of regularly brings up this story about some woman who was married to a friend of his, and she's still getting alimony or something, and it's sort of, you can sort of the issues with women and the dislike in some ways of women, and as if they're oppressing men just by being or expecting to be treated well, I don't know about that story about the alimony. I don't know, what the story is really with that. So I'll just put that to the side. But it's almost this resentment at having to treat women with the same sort of respect that women would expect, like if they were, like the same equal respect that men get, basically. And you could take that further to, some of the guests are borderline alt-right, or they're actually alt-right. And I feel like this whole alt-right thing is often just an excuse to revert back to treating women, wanting to treat women like crap and put them in their place and complain about everything about them. Basically, this huge resentment towards women, just like the same sort of, but it's worse than the resentment they have towards, whoops, I'm hoping that's just, she's just jumping on leaves. It's the same kind of resentment in a way that, that the alt-right and people who aren't even in the alt-right like to blame migrants for, the things that are wrong in their life, as if migrants are responsible. Any sort of group, like an LGBT group or whatever. But women seem to be this easy target today. It's like misogyny. I've mentioned this before in my vlogs. You know, that misogyny is a kind of a totally acceptable way of behaving on social media. And if you're not a woman, just try and imagine not only having to deal with how the world likes to always criticize women's appearances and sort of basically, you know, a lot of women's worth still through the mainstream media is on how they look, you know, their appearance, their body shape and so forth. And then imagine having to then deal with online, if somebody doesn't like something that you say, they immediately revert to all the misogynist things that, like, you know, criticizing one's appearance and so forth. I mean, I know a number of women online who, you know, sort of are in the public eye, and it doesn't even matter if you look like Abby Martin or, you know, who's very, you know, she's a young woman, and I'd say a lot of people find her attractive. You know, she's sort of she's kind of like, well, she's not a stereotypically attractive, but she's an attractive woman, right? Even people that look like Abby Martin still get the full-on misogyny. Of course, it shouldn't matter what you look like. It shouldn't matter if I look like a, you know, sort of a, if I had, you know, tumors all over my head or 5 heads. I mean, you know, you know, it's a person. I'm a person, right? But you know, it's like now there's sort of there's more and more of these alt-right type individuals, and men from that involuntary celibate group, and just men who like to troll. They like to pick on certain vulnerable groups, and they're not going to really get much back. I mean, they're not going to have women suddenly picking up, doxing them and then going around and trying to, you know, sort of be violent towards them. So it's a real coward's thing to do, you know, this kind of just picking on groups that they know they're not going to have any trouble from. But if you're a woman, you probably know what I mean about the misogyny. I mean, I've been doing vlogs and live streams for, I think at least a couple of years now. And before that, you know, I've just been doing vegan education and, you know, sort of other social justice things, activism. And so probably about over 10 years, say, online activism. But the recent, in particular, the recent vlogs and live streams that I've been doing, attracts, as it does with most women online, it attracts the occasional, you know, sort of extreme misogyny. People who don't have men who don't have an argument, and then immediately revert to misogyny because they don't have an argument. That is a typical thing. And it's kind of disgusting, really, that at this stage, particularly when we're possibly going to go extinct, that we're still stuck in this quagmire of toxic masculinity and all that means for women, with the epidemic of violence towards women. You know, the 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, I think it's probably 1 in 3, and that's probably conservative, women are sort of have been sexually assaulted by the time they're, you know, 20 or whatever, or 18 or something. I don't know. There's some ridiculous, extreme statistics about that. You know, there's epidemics of domestic violence. I mean, in Australia, every week there's some woman killed by a partner, a male partner. You know, in Brazil, I think 10 women every day are killed in domestic violence. And you know, it's sort of different countries have different statistics, but there's this level of misogyny that puts women in, you know, some sort of danger of some kind at some point in their life or regularly. I mean, if you're a woman, if you go out, you know, particularly at nighttime, or you're coming out of a venue at nighttime, you have to sort of have various, you know, you have to have these different survival things that you do. Doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, there's different things that women go through in their minds, what they need to do if this happens or if that happens, you know, and trying to arrange a schedule so that they are safer and stuff like that. But getting back to, you know, the Joe Rogan and that site, I'm subscribed to that site, that YouTube channel, and every so often, you know, they'll have some guest on who's sort of supposedly critiquing feminists or whatever, or critiquing something about women, and it's really just having a dig at women, basically. It's really just an opportunity to have a big fucking gripe about women. It's really kind of pathetic. And yet it's totally, you know, it's done in this very proper manner, as if it's a sort of a real interview and a real discussion. But underneath it all, it's just this sort of real, you know, you can feel this sort of dislike of women, really, and any sort of power that they might have today. There's a real resentment. And you only have to look in the comments section of these Joe Rogan sort of live streams that he does when he's talking about some issue to do with women. And the amount of misogyny and hatred of women, and also the homophobia and the transphobia and all of that in these comment sections, I mean, 98% of them are just awful. So he's got this real sort of almost like an alt-right kind of a following in a way. And yet, you probably wouldn't characterize him as alt-right. So what is it about his channel, Joe Rogan's channel, that is attracting these kind of men? And I would guess that the content that he puts out has this underlying sort of an underlying kind of a misogyny and an underlying sort of a dislike of women. It's from his mouth, it's not really, well, I haven't watched very many shows of his because I have a trouble stomaching it. There's something about this sort of, he does do this macho thing and thinks that killing animals is kind of just hunky-dory, and not regularly talks about that. There's this whole sort of bit of a kind of a, I don't even know what you call it, but it's a sort of a reverting back to sort of, you know, this stereotype of men. It's kind of like trying to hang on to a stereotype of men, thinking that that's what men should be. That's what it feels like, you know, sort of killing animals, guns, you know, lots of weightlifting. When you talk about you know, having sex with women, it's, you know, you use certain language that, you know, is kind of a bit, you know, sort of locker room sort of stuff. I find it a very confusing kind of a channel because I feel like because it's attracting so many of these incel sort of types and major misogynists, that it's actually, I find it in some ways a bit of a lightning rod in some ways for that sort of thing, and giving it a kind of acceptability in a way, you know? That's what it feels like, and I find there's more and more of that online. And I think this whole alt-right thing is gives a lot of men an excuse. They say they're this because, you know, of, oh, they're immigrants are taking away their jobs. Well, that's BS. They usually always major misogynists, like Cernovich, you know, and he's sort of often, he's sort of thinks rape is fine and all that kind of thing. And I feel there's this real push to return to that kind of thing, where push back to the point where women are just in the fucking kitchen having children, and they can be raped in marriage and all that kind of, you know, stuff that used to happen, but still happens, of course, but it was more, you know, more acceptable decades ago. And I just find, as I've said, I find it just appalling and really sad that we're probably on the edge of extinction and we're actually going backwards. I feel we're going backwards in many ways. This misogyny seems to be, it's like this real extreme push to get back to the days where men were the, you know, quote unquote breadwinners, and women were at home and just doing everything they could to please their man and all this kind of thing. And as someone who is heterosexual, someone who is not heterosexual, looking at this whole sort of, this whole bizarre kind of a, where there's sort of people that are hanging on to grim death to these sort of really unfortunate stereotypes, gender stereotypes that are constructed, that are actually very toxic for the planet, toxic for one another. It's abusive towards men who have raised in these toxic masculine stereotypes. It's abusive for women in the sort of stereotypes they're raised in, if they are. But, you know, and it's abusive for women that men are, you know, it's still cultivated in society. For all that we think that we are moving forward and progressing, really, we're not really. You know, we're actually, I feel at this point now we're going backwards. Like with fascism is also another, you know, how capitalism is morphing into fascism. We have people like Bolsonaro who talk about women, you know, the leader of Brazil, talks about women has said to somebody, some woman recently, you're too something or other to rape. Basically, she's not good enough for him to rape. He's actually said things like that. That's the sort of way in some ways that we're heading. It's a cowardly, sad thing. Cowardly and pathetic. And yet that's sort of, I see that more and more. And I think also online it gives you this skewed idea. It gives you a skewed view of the world too. Because there are sad little groups of men who literally search all day online. I don't think they have anything better to do with their lives than look for ways to have a go at feminists, to have a go at women in general. I had somebody just yesterday on my, the day before, when I was talking about celebrity vegans. He came on, and instead of critiquing the content, he started launching into this anti-feminist diatribe and you know, sort of you know, basically ridiculous misogyny. I find that sort of kind of sad that there are some really angry men who just, they think that hating women and hating on women and ridiculing them, ridiculing their appearance and all this kind of stuff somehow is a good thing to do. Somehow women are to blame for their predicament. There's quite a lot of men who seem to think women are to blame for their life situation. I mean, truly, it's incredibly childish. It gives children a bad name to be blaming women for that. How about blaming power structures? How about blaming neoliberalism and capitalism, unfettered capitalism, and ridiculous, pathetic so-called leaders in government? How about blaming the way we've allowed this disintegration of community through neoliberalism? How about blaming the real problem, which is those that we've allowed to end up governing us and creating this dysfunctional sort of a setting in society where people can't sort of survive. They're just barely hanging on, a lot of people. And I'm talking about, this is first world problems now, okay, I'm talking about. But how about looking at the cause instead of looking at vulnerable groups? This is what happens when there's a lot of social inequality in society. People, instead of turning and looking at those that are responsible, the people in power, they start turning on migrants and vulnerable groups. This happens over and over again throughout history. And it's happening again. You can see it now more and more. Even in Australia, it's kind of awful. I'm appalled at the way there's certain Australians talk about people from different cultures and try to blame Muslims for, they try to vilify Muslims at every turn. Anytime there's something that's said on social media, they'll try and blame Muslims for something. Every time, like if there's some poor man who was wearing, I think he was Pakistani, he went a little bit, he had major psychological problems, and he went a bit crazy and knifed a couple of people in Melbourne a couple of months ago. And he was shot and he was killed by the police. And the people who want to put out that narrative that Muslims are, that Muslims are evil and inherently evil and stuff, they insist that it was a terrorist act, when if he'd been just an everyday citizen, he wasn't in sort of a Muslim garb, like he was wearing a kind of a, the Pakistani sort of long shirt and the pants, and he had a sort of hat, kufi on, I think it's called. If it hadn't been somebody like that, people would have been saying, well, he had mental health problems. But no, they have to say, he's a terrorist. That's typical all over the world. And that's what social inequality and war have brought us. This perpetual war with US empire, which I talk about regularly. They are the victims. Muslims are the victims. But no, we like to, vilify immigrants, people who are asylum seekers who are fleeing the devastation we have created the West has created in their countries. We like to vilify them and refuse them entry or stick them in detention like we do in Australia, where they end up self-harming or killing themselves. Instead of sort of welcoming these people whom we've helped create this devastation in their home country. So if we want to, we're going to have to do a few things, really. We're going to have to address these toxic gender stereotypes that are really, they actually affect children in many negative ways. Young boys who are not allowed to be emotional, and eventually that actually affects their education ability, their ability to take in information. They start to do poorer. It affects the way they interact with other, other children. It affects them later on. And it's not good enough. Like in Australia, we'll have these domestic violence education sort of advertisements, and they'll sort of, which are good, but the thing is that this has to be a whole change in the way we, are as people, as individuals. We need to just be allowed to be however we want to be. Whatever gender that is, it doesn't have to be a binary thing. That's a social construct. Just allow people to be whatever they are, trans, gender diverse, and that's okay. It shouldn't be seen as some kind of threat. But it is a threat, and it's also a threat to patriarchy. Patriarchy relies on these binaries. It relies on toxic masculinity that feeds the wars. If you don't have this, if you don't have, if you have men that are empathetic and value justice, then you're going to have trouble getting this cannon fodder for these oligarchic wars, for resources and etc. So it benefits, the oligarchy, it benefits the 1%, it benefits patriarchy to continue on with these binary toxic gender stereotypes. And it keeps imperialism going and all that. So, we're really going to have to look at that. And the other thing is we're going to have to get rid of capitalism because it's inextricably linked to imperialism and war, and it's morphing into fascism, and it's causing tremendous social inequality. It can't do anything else but cause tremendous social inequality. It can't do anything else but be a racist and a classist system. So we're going to have to get rid of that. We're going to have to stop exploiting animals and go vegan. That's another thing, because that's all linked. If you're exploiting the vulnerable, the greatest vulnerable group on the planet now, the invisible group, is non-human animals. 99.99% of the planet's population are non-human animals. They're the most vulnerable group on the planet. And what we do to animals, we do to other people. It's just, it's all linked. And they're sentient beings. Just because they're in other species is an irrelevant criterion as to whether they belong to our moral community. Anyway, so I've gone off the track about Joe Rogan, but I sort of see that, as almost like a grooming sort of a channel. It kind of grooms men to sort of, it reinforces these sort of, in a sort of very, sometimes a very sort of a subtle way. It grooms men to sort of, and it reinforces these negative stereotypes that are causing so much violence and misogyny. It's, I feel like it's more dangerous than these just totally outright, no apologies, just straight out outright, full on, it's in your face. I find these kind of like Joe Rogan channels to be more insidious, much more insidious, and sort of validating a sort of a way of being for some men that is very dangerous for women. And like, I've even considered, should I even allow comments for this video? Because for sure there will be either at least one misogynist, if they pay it. I mean, my channel is a small channel. Who knows if anybody, there's a certain amount of people, and I thank you for your support, that watch these videos, but it's almost like there's a small group of men that go around searching out things to have a go at, and if it's related to women and how women are treated and all that kind of thing. So I sort of thought, should I allow comments, because I'm sure to have people get on and make misogynist comments about my appearance, about what I say, yada 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 yada. I mean, it's just sort of, the sort of things that I've been called online, not as bad as what, say, trans women get called online, or sort of it's trans women get full-on misogyny, but I've had some pretty humdingers of things said to me. And it kind of rolls off me because I just sort of think, well, I just think it's very sad. And I try to have good thoughts for men who their self-esteem is so poor that they feel like it elevates them to criticize and say hideous things to women about their appearance or about whatever. And that they feel so disempowered in their life that their way of making themselves feel better is to say awful things to either vulnerable groups or to you know, people from different cultural backgrounds or whatever. It's very, very sad. So I try to have good thoughts. Sometimes I just kind of, you know, but I always reach for the block button because I can't be bothered engaging. Life is too short to waste on that. You know, if somebody can't engage with me in a civil way, I don't have much interest in, and if they can't engage the content, you know, everything I say on this, whatever I say, right, on this channel, I don't think of myself that everything I say is, I'm always right, or, you know, I don't think that at all. If I thought that everything I said was right, I would still be not vegan. You know, I would not be vegan. I wouldn't be a few things, right? I'd still be stuck in a way in my sort of teens or something. I mean, obviously, we all learn, but I try to learn, and I try to listen to opinions as long as, you know, they're civil, and as long as they're not sort of denying science, or they've sort of considered a few things. It seems like now people just give opinions without any sort of, they give opinions without any sort of like research or talking to people. It's just these knee-jerk hate responses, you know? And that's really sad. Anyway, but I just wanted to say something about channels like Joe Rogan, which I feel are insidious because they support these sort of unfortunate attitudes. They sort of reinforce a sort of a masculinity which I think its days should be up, because look at the mess we're in. I'm not blaming men for everything. There's women who have supported all that or are as bad in some ways, in a different way. But patriarchy is alive and well, and we're on the verge of extinction, because like if people are not empathetic and and try and be fair and just and compassionate, then this is the natural conclusion to that, what we have today, with really a social breakdown basically, and capitalism gone mad to the point where it's quite happy to, you know, mow down the lungs of the planet, the Amazon rainforest, and just do insane things that they're just insane. It's ecocidal, and we're quite happy to do that. And that's where patriarchy has got us. And I think, unfortunately, patriarchy has won, because we're on our way out. There's a sort of, as Chris Hedges sort of calls it, I don't know if I totally agree with this, but there's a kind of a death drive to all this sort of stuff. Anyway, I just wanted to say something about this Joe Rogan channel, because, and I saw something about Hannah Gadsby, the comedian who's gay, and she's a sort of a fairly androgynous, and the comments in that section of Joe Rogan's just that video about her were really misogynist. They were, you know, referring to Hannah Gadsby as a he, and trying to look like a man, and all this, you know, all this stuff that you would hope would have remained in the last century, you know, or something, but no. And there was just like literally hundreds of comments like that. So why is it that that channel attracts so much misogyny and hatred of women? You know, one has to ask oneself, What is it about about Joe Rogan's channel and channels like him that attract that in such great numbers? It's not the occasional thing. It's literally, you know, for the Hannah Gadsby thing, there was like 98%, 99% of the comments were really foul and hateful and, you know, just full-on misogynist. And that's the problem. It's like on social media, misogyny is just seen as just acceptable. You know, on Facebook, they just say that hasn't, you know, that hasn't gone against community standards. So, you know, I mean, there's other things that don't go against their community standards either. Their standards are very weird. They're okay with war, but they're not okay with anybody promoting peace and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, you know, the thing is, misogyny and sexism leads to violence against women. That's the bottom line. Just as racism leads to violence against other races, and speciesism leads to violence against non-human animals and the use of animals, it's just how it is. So, you know, if we can't sort of treat misogyny and sexism as very serious as a society, and start to educate children that it's not okay, and that our mainstream media isn't constantly reinforcing these toxic masculine stereotypes, which it is, it has to be a whole thing, like it takes a community kind of thing, you know? But that's not going to happen because capitalism wants to make money. Capitalism is all about profit at any expense. So, you know, mainstream media is not going to change the way they do business, and you know, and just as an addition to what I was saying about Joe Rogan, Joe Rogan's channel, this isn't a criticism particularly of him, although, you know, I feel some of the things he says about women make me uncomfortable. But, you know, it actually pays to be an alt-right sort of leaning or alt-right person today. You know, you can be a real grifter if you support that particular position, and you're, you know, you can rake it in. It really pays off to be a racist, misogynist, warmonger, and major conspiracy theorist. If you're, you know, like I'm talking major conspiracy theorists where you just invent nonsense and complete nonsense. It really pays today, and that just shows how far gone we are. You know. But anyway, that's all I really wanted to say. I guess I don't really have a conclusion to all of this, except for education, you know, in schools, and taking these, like misogyny, seriously. That it is a real problem, firstly, and why it's a problem, and then seriously address it. Because, like, why do women have to be constantly sort of trying to just get basic rights, and why are women always in threat of some sort of violence, or have to be on the receiving end of hatred and criticism of appearance, and all the time? It's just all the time, really, if you pay attention. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So thanks so much for watching. I might leave the ability to make a comment in the comments section, or I may not, you know, because I don't have the time or the inclination to sort of listen to the misogynist nonsense that some people like to post for fun. I don't, but I might, you know, who knows. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, and if you like it, please click the like button, click the notifications bell for updates, and be kind to one another. Until next time, bye for now.